let's get right into it. The abuse of public office for private gain. It's one of humanity's oldest stories, right? But from simple bribes to these incredibly complex global schemes, the story is constantly changing. So today, we're going to trace that history of high-level corruption to really understand how we fight it in the here and now. So, what are we even talking about in terms of money? Well, the United Nations figures that a staggering $3.6 trillion gets lost to corruption every single year. That's through bribes, stolen money, you name it. I mean, that is just a massive, massive drain on the global economy, way more than we'd need to solve some of the world's biggest problems. But you know, the real cost isn't just about the cash. When you see your leaders playing by a totally different set of rules, it just shatters public trust. And that loss of faith, that feeling that the whole system is rigged, that is the deepest, most lasting damage that corruption does to a society. To really get a handle on the problem today, we have to look back. Because sure, the technology and the methods have changed like crazy, but that fundamental temptation of power, yeah, that's as old as government itself. And you can really see how the methods have evolved over time. I mean, in ancient Rome, it was often just straight up bribery to win elections or become a so-called tax farmer. Then you fast forward to 18th century Britain, and it's morphed into this systemic web of patronage they called old corruption. And by the time we get to America's Gilded Age, it's a whole new ballgame. Massive corporations literally capturing the state itself. The Romans were so familiar with this problem, they even had a specific legal term for it, ombutus. This was organized electoral bribery. Aspiring politicians would borrow absolute fortunes just to, pay off voters directly. The whole thing got so out of hand that a lot of historians see this debt as a major factor in the financial chaos that helped bring down the Roman Republic. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because you see this critical shift. Britain's old corruption was basically an internal system, elites looking out for their friends and family from inside the government. But what you saw in America's Gilded Age was the beginning of an external system of state capture, where these powerful robber barons used their insane wealth to bend the government to their will from the outside. Okay, so those historical models really set the stage for the modern era. Now we're going to look at a few key scandals that show just how much the scale and the complexity of corruption exploded in the 20th and 21st centuries. And this table, it just lays out the story of that escalation perfectly. You start with Teapot Dome in the 1920s. Simple, one-off individual greed. Then you move to Watergate, and it's about the abuse of executive power itself. That evolves into the Watergate case, which is full-on corporate systematized bribery. And it all culminates in the Panama Papers, which just ripped the lid off this vast global shadow economy built specifically for the elite. The details from these early scandals almost seem quaint now. I mean, the bribe that took down a US cabinet member in the Teapot Dome scandal was just $100,000 in cash, and it was famously delivered in what was described as a little brown satchel. It's such a tangible, almost cinematic image of old-school graft, isn't it? Okay, now compare that little satchel of cash to this. A century later, the Brazilian construction giant Watergate wasn't doing backroom deals. No, they industrialized bribery. They created an entire corporate department, the Division of Structured Operations, with its own budget, its own secret communication system, all just to manage illegal payments. And then you've got the sheer audacity of the 1MDB scandal in Malaysia. This is textbook kleptocracy, when a leader treats the country's treasury like their own personal piggy bank. Over $4.5 billion was siphoned from a state fund that was supposed to help the Malaysian people. And that stolen money was spent on, a super yacht, priceless paintings by Monet, and get this, they even used it to finance the movie The Wolf of Wall Street. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So, okay, these stories are incredible, but what's the actual real-world cost? Let's take a look at why this kind of high-level plunder really matters to every single one of us. So here's the bottom line. The International Monetary Fund found that in more corrupt countries, the slice of the budget going to essential things like education and healthcare is a full 1/3 lower than in less corrupt nations. What does that actually mean? It translates directly into hospitals without medicine and schools without books. But there is a powerful pattern you see throughout this history. First, a huge scandal erupts, something like Watergate. This sparks massive public outrage, which in turn creates this unstoppable political pressure. And the result? It's often landmark reform, like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which was designed specifically to stop it from ever happening again. It seems like progress is almost always born from crisis. So, with all that history in mind, what's the state of the fight today? Let's look at the future battlefield and where the front line against corruption is heading right now. And this number from Transparency International tells a pretty sobering story. The global average score for perceived corruption is just stuck. It's at a dismal 43 out of 100. Let's be real, that is not a passing grade. It means more than 2/3 of all countries are seen as having a serious corruption problem. The fight is clearly far from over. And that fight today is basically a technological arms race. On one side, you've got kleptocrats using digital anonymity and super complex financial tricks to hide their stolen money. But on the other side, investigators are now using AI and machine learning to sift through enormous amounts of data, detecting fraud and flagging suspicious patterns in real time. So the ultimate strategy, the big game plan, is to basically dismantle the architecture of secrecy that allows corruption to thrive in the first place. That means pushing for things like public registries so we know who really owns these shell companies. It means regulating the lawyers and accountants who enable these schemes. And it means empowering a free press to act as a watchdog for all of us. Which, of course, brings us to the final critical question. The methods for hiding money are getting more sophisticated every single day. So in this new digital battlefield, can the forces of transparency and accountability ever really win the arms race against the politics of plunder?